This time I'll call this meeting of the South Central Pennsylvania Genealogical Society to order. My name is Richard Conkle and I'm the Society's president. Do we have any first-time visitors with us today? A bunch of them. Look at that one lady back there. Could you give me your names, please? I think you sit over here. What are your names? Kimball? Yeah. Okay. Okay, and I think I saw some other ones. Yes. Okay. And who else do we have?
Amanda Eckenberg.
Okay. We're delighted to have you here with us today. Was there anyone over here? First time. She's with you. Okay. Well, we're delighted to have you. This is not our usual space that we occupy when we have meetings, just so you know. We're usually in the meeting hall, but that was booked for another event, so we're here today. At this time, I guess I will have minutes from our last meeting read by an acting secretary, Erica Rumpels. She's been taking the minutes here lately.
And actually, I'm looking at January's minutes, and there's a note that last month we didn't have the November minutes, so I'll be starting with those. And then it was December's treasurer and membership report will be presented at the January meeting. And so this is November. Nicole Smith, director of the York County Library and Archives, gave an overview of November's upcoming History Center's programming. Jonathan Stair, who is our vice president, encouraged interested parties to read the York County History Center Library issue of the National Geological Society, which has two stories about the 1950 federal census that will be released in April of 2022. He described the first three programs offered in 2022. These can be seen at our website. Jonathan then introduced presenter Scott Minkus, who will speak on the churches and chaplains of York County during the Civil War. Then the program meeting minutes for January the 2nd. Richard Conkle started the meeting by asking for new visitors. We talked a bit about the history of New Year's Day when we started the business meeting. The November program meeting, Martha Berg presented the October, November, and December treasurer's report as follows. Opening balance for October was $19,261.32. Receipts for that month were $220 for renewals and new memberships and publication sales. There were no receipts in November and December. Disbursements for October totaled $267.77, which included $25.44 for sales tax, $119.33 for the September-October newsletter by Postal Connections, and $125 for a donation to the Commonwealth of PA for Speaker Aaron McWilliams. November disbursements, which totaled $1,532 for speaker fee for Scott Minkus, $125. Postal Connections for publication 86, $977.32. Staples for publication envelopes, and $56.66 for USPS mailing publication 86. That was 300%. The December disbursement was for $132.65 for connections. For the November-December newsletter, this brought the end of year total balance to $17,546.16. The membership report included the following. There were a total of 147 members, which included 5 new members, 20 renewals, and 3 deceased members. Along with the docket of upcoming January programs, Nicole Smith announced that newspapers.com had uploaded additional newspapers from the archival collection here. Many of these were smaller newspapers, but in some cases, older newspapers. After giving a rundown of the upcoming programs, Jonathan Stair introduced our guest speaker. Mark Schermeyer, who spoke about the lives and legacies of the Temple family.
Thank you, Erica. Any additions or corrections to those minutes? Hearing none, they stand approved as read. I did want to mention a certain historic event from today. Probably some of you, if you watched the news today, you would know what happened 70 years ago. George VI passed away, and Queen Elizabeth II became Queen of the United Kingdom and the rest of whatever realm she's had over the years. And I think if she makes it 2.5 more years on the throne, she'll surpass Louis XIV as the longest reigning European monarch. So I'm rooting for her. Don't care for Louis XIV that much. At this time, we'll have our treasurer, Margaret Burke, give our treasurer's report.
Okay, the treasurer's report for January 2022. The balance at January 1st was $17,546.16. There were no receipts for January. Disbursements were to the York History Center. We purchased a book for the library. That was $79.47. And to Mark Schermeyer, the speaker fee for the January meeting. $125. Total disbursements for January were $204.47, leaving the net cash balance at January 31st, 2022, $17,341.69. The membership report, 149 members. We also have 15 families, which adds another 15 people to that. So we have a total of 164 members. And we do have, of those members, 21 life members. And we have 5 new for this year, this fiscal year, July through June.
Thank you, Margaret. That report will be filed for audit. This time we'll have news from the York County History Center from the librarian and archivist Nicole Smith.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming, and I do apologize. Thank you for your patience with our need to be in this room as opposed to our larger meeting hall. But it's great to see such a nice crowd today. Welcome. If you're watching from home and you have any questions, please type them in the chat feature or comments on Facebook. All of our programs are being recorded and live streamed on the History Center Facebook page. Watch the recordings later on History Center YouTube channel. Just look up York County History Center on YouTube. A couple of upcoming programs. Our second Saturday speaker is Richard Wagner, who will be speaking about brewing and breweries in York. Our Civil War Roundtable is February 16th. That is a webinar only. And speakers are Scott Mingus and Jim McClure, who will speak about rediscovering lost Underground Railroad and Civil War sites. We also have a webinar coming up on the 17th with Dr. Peter Levy of York College, and he'll be speaking about Daisy Myers. His talk's called Daisy Myers and the Quest for the American Dream. More information about any of our programs, please visit yorkhistorycenter.org. Thanks.
Thank you, Nicole. At this time, we will have our Vice President, Jonathan Stair, introduce today's speaker as well as give future programs. Just wanted to say a quick word about today's speaker. I had the pleasure 10 years ago of having some Italian lessons from him with a group. It's the first time I traveled to Italy, and he's an excellent teacher. He's really an engaging linguist, very interested in many languages. I think some of the rest of you here have had him for other languages as well. I believe German and some other So I think we're in for a treat today. Jonathan will introduce the program.
As far as upcoming programs, next month, March the 6th, we will be having Brad Hemming, who's a local gunsmith, speaking about 18th century gunsmithing in Eastern Pennsylvania. And he told me, and this is for the people who are watching out there in Zoom land or wherever that is, he told me it's best if you come and see this in person. He's going to be bringing some, I think, guns with him as well as tools and so forth. And he felt it'd be better to interact with the audience if you're here to see the things that he has to show. On Sunday, April the 3rd, our own Tom Gibson, where's Tom? Tom Gibson will be speaking to us down at the Colonial Courthouse. Never been to Colonial Courthouse. This is an opportunity to go inside there. He's going to be talking to us about challenges that faced Continental Congress in Yorktown. And then our final speaker of the spring will be Tyler Stuck from the Pennsylvania State Archives, talking about the history and records of state mental hospitals. So if you've had any ancestors who were in state mental hospitals, this is a good opportunity to come learn about what records are available, how to access them, and also he has some good background to share about their history. As you can see on the screen, our speaker today is Chip Kaufman. He is a retired certified U.S. government linguist, and he has taught adjunct courses at York College. If you part of the OLLI program, York Penn State, he's also spoken to OLLI as well. I got to know Chip while we were digging together out of Camp Security. As I've told anybody I've ever met, if you want to work with somebody, Chip's the best person to work with because he always has the best stories to tell. And they are very interesting. I was never bored a minute that I was working with Chip. So I'd like to give a warm welcome to Chip Kaufman.
You know, there you go.
Yeah.
You have to point to the laptop.
It was working.
You sit there and I'll hit the button.
You can do it? Okay.
Oh, there's no chair there. I can't drag it across all these wires.
I can carry it for you. You want one?
Hi, everyone. We'll be with you in a minute.
Better, is that right?
Yeah.
I'll hit the button when you need it.
Are you down that or am I? Okay. That's me.
You're good.
Got it.
Okay.
Well, I always come prepared. I have an extra laptop. Okay. Правда, нас говорит, чего странного, Konstasi. Chip Kaufman is on the said welcome in Welsh, in Scottish, and in Irish. Crusoe is Welsh. Okay. I'm going to have to take my jacket. I know that many of you might be basketball fans and you have the Boston Celtics, but I'm going to stick with the Greek pronunciation, the people who originally gave these people their name, the Celts. The Celts. Okay, it's a pleasure to be here. Jonathan, Richard, everyone who is here, Nicole, have been especially helpful. Thank you very much. I hope the folks at home can engage in this as well. So welcome to those of you as well at home. Okay, I'm going to be talking about the languages that came from Europe. Everybody thinks they came from the British Isles. Well, they did, but there's a long history before that. I'm going to go through some of the early history, and then I'm going to talk about the second part of the talk will be about Pennsylvania, predominantly Pennsylvania, and the Celtic language influence that we have in Pennsylvania. I think this will be interesting for many of you, especially if you're Pennsylvania residents. Okay, what do we mean by Celtic? It's important to understand historical perspectives on the language, the people, the culture, and so if you'll go along with me, I'm going to talk about this, about the historical perspectives. So what do we mean by Celt? Who were the Celts? Where were they? I think you're all in for some surprises. When did the Celts appear? And why? I have to drink some whiskey. That's whiskey is the word for water in Irish. Okay. So the origins of the Celtic people go back 6,000 years. So we're talking about before Common Era, 4,000 BCE, BC. Can you folks read the? Okay. And then the second part, I'm going to talk about the 17th century to the 19th century. Now, this ranges from about 1680 when the Welsh came to Pennsylvania to about 1930 with the Irish. We had the Irish predominantly in the 1800s. So we have the early 1700s, the mid to late 1700s with the Scottish and the Scotch-Irish. And then we get into the mid to late 1800s with the Irish. So the Celts were people who all spoke related languages. There were many tribes, dozens and dozens of tribes. The thing that they leave us, the Celts give us a legacy of naming places. I'm very interested in names, as I'm sure you are interested in names. Tracing names, where they come from. They left a legacy in all sorts of place names. And when they came to Pennsylvania, these three different groups, they brought that legacy with them. We have hundreds of place names in Pennsylvania that come from Welsh, Irish, Scottish. There might even be a couple Cornish. There are also Celts. But these people spoke related languages. They were all over ancient Europe. They're mentioned in the Bible, the Galatians. You might have heard of the Galatians. They were Celts. Why do we know they were Celts? Because they spoke languages that were common to the Celtic people. It's almost like modern day Latin-based languages like Portuguese and Spanish and French and Italian, how you can relate back to the mother language. And this is what linguists do. They study languages and where they came from and how they're related. And they take them apart, almost like you take apart a computer to see why it works. I worked in the intelligence business. And one of the things that was interesting in the intelligence business was how some of our technicians could go to an embassy that was overrun, and we could take apart the equipment, and you just take it apart to figure out and then put it back together to find out how it works. And we do that with languages. Okay, that's called reconstruction. So we had all these tribes from Iberia. Iberia, how many of you know where Iberia is? Okay, the country name is, anyone? Spain. Iberia came from the Celts, from Iberus. They named the river Iberus. And we have Gaul. Where's Gaul? France, okay? Gaul means strength and power in the Celtic language. Italia, of course, if you know where Italia is. And Galatia is present-day Turkey. The modern languages are Irish, Scottish. Now, I use the word Gaelic. Well, what does Gaelic mean? It means it comes back from the Celtic original Celtic languages. The Irish don't like to use the word Gaelic, even though when they say, do you speak Irish, they'll use the word Gaelic in it. The Welsh, Breton, anyone know where Breton might be spoken? Brittany, yes, Brittany is in northwest France. We're going to talk about it. So, Cornish and Manx. I've been to the Isle of Man. I tried to speak with a couple of people in Manx, and there are very few people who speak Manx. But it's a dead language which was resurrected. There are some people who speak that. Okay, this is going to be my little breaker slide. Okay, so that's telling you that I'm moving to another subject. That's sort of the intro. The historical perspectives. Not everybody agrees on where the Celts came from and who they were, but we take these disciplines, we look at the historical record. When you have historical record, the historical record of the Greeks, you have Plato, Romans with Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar, when he wasn't waging war, was writing a whole lot of accounts about people, about the Germanic people, about the Celts, and he wrote a work called Celticum. And so much of what we know about the early Celts comes from Julius Caesar's work, Celticum. Archaeology. There are two major areas of Europe. The Hallstatt culture, and the other is Latin, which is in France, Latin culture. What has been excavated is jewelry, weapons, wagons. The word carpenter comes from original Celtic, carpentius, carpentarius, for the people who make wheels, wheelwrights. Linguistics. I'm a linguist. A linguist does the scientific study of languages. Common dialects of the tribes. While they're not exactly the same, if you speak Portuguese, como estás? How are you? Como estás in Spanish. You can hear those similarities and differences. So linguists look at those. Genetics. How do genetics play in the study of people and where people came from? You look at the various haplogroups. Has anyone ever done the National Geographic Genographic project where you do the swab in your cheek? You know, yeah. The genographic one goes back hundreds of thousands of years. And they're able to determine, like my family went out into my Y chromosome, the father, the paternal side went out into the northwest part of India, up into China, and then they decided, we like German beer too much, so we turned around and came back to Switzerland and Germany. And they're able to trace migrations. I don't want to get too hung up on genetics, but there's a particular haplogroup called R1b, which really points to the Celts. And the Celts, you look at these heat maps that go across Europe, and the British Isles are loaded with R1b. Now, at the risk of putting my shoe in my mouth, I should say, at the risk of putting a brogue in my mouth, a brogue is a shoe. And I'll tell you about the word brogue in a little bit. The gene that is associated with red hair is very heavily in the R1b haplogroup. Okay. Now, I hope I don't get anybody screaming through their microphone at home on their computer, but so I'm going to leave it at that. It's just, I threw out a little morsel for you to jump on, and I hope that you can take that further in your reading. And then anthropology. Anthropology is study of all the culture, what people do to sustain life. And that could be jewelry, it could be vehicles, and all sorts of things. Okay, here's a depiction of what the Celts might have looked like. I will talk about the word that the Celts who painted their faces. It's where we got the word Briton from the Greek word Britannicae, meaning the face painters. Okay, so I teach a course at York College. I've been teaching it there since 2006. There was a professor, Dr. Heinz Hosch, who taught that course. And it's a very interesting course. I believe Richard, you had that course too. Yeah. And one of my best students that's sitting right here. And so this slide shows you the point of origin of the Indo-European people in the Pontic steppes of present-day Ukraine and parts of Kazakhstan. All right, okay. So each one of these arrows represents a migratory pattern. And those people had genes that we could track. They had archaeological artifacts that we can find. And we're able to determine the languages and reverse engineer the languages back to an original language. And the Celts are part of that. The Celts are right. So this little dot does come in here. The Celts are right. They go over here. They go down into the Iberian Peninsula and eventually become the people of Ireland, Northern Ireland, Wales, Scotland, Cornwall, and so forth. A lot of people don't realize there were three major languages in the ancient world. And the three major languages, now Persian is sort of off into Asia, Central Asia, which is present-day Iran. The Greek language, Eliki, you have Latina, which is the Latin language, and Gallican, which is Celtic. So the Celtic languages were a major part of Europe thousands of years ago. So where did they come from? The Greeks called them Keltoi. The Keltoi, that's a Greek word which means the outsiders. The Celts didn't call themselves Keltoi. That is an exonym. An exonym is what outsiders call them. Like we would call the Iroquois, we call that the Indians in New York, American Indians in the New York region, we would call them Iroquois. But that's not what they call themselves. That's an exonym. An endonym is what they call themselves, the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse. Sorry, I'm mixing cultures here, but I just wanted to use that as an example. But the Celts called themselves Celtic Bay, Galatai, Celtiki, Gali, Celtibiri, Belgae, Aquitani, and many, many more. So you might think, ooh, Belgae. Yes, Belgium came from Celtic language. So where and when did the Celts appear? Here you see the Galatians out here in Turkey, present-day Turkey. That was called Anatolia. And then here you have in the area of Ukraine, Moldova, and so forth. These are all Celtic areas. You see the light green here in the northern part of Italy. The Celts and the Italic people shared land, culture, food sources, and so forth. So there are a lot of Celtic words in my beloved Italian language. Here's another map. Everybody likes maps. So you can see the division. This was all Celtic area. And the Celts were not as war-waging as the Romans, but the Romans who come about, Rome was established in 753 BC, but the Romans come over into what they call Hispania, and they take over Spain, and the Celts need to clear out. So the early Celtic languages, a proto-language is a basic common language that many people speak with variations. We have dialects. We have people in Pennsylvania who say soda. We have people who call it pop. That's a variation in the language, but we can understand each other, mutual intelligibility. I mentioned earlier the word Gaul gives rise to the meaning power and strength. So some of the early Celtic languages, they didn't have a writing system. And what they did was they used the writing of Greek, Etruscan. The Etruscans on the boot of Italy, they worked with the Greeks. The Etruscans gave the Greeks wine-producing capability, and the Greeks, in turn, gave the Etruscans the alphabet that they had gotten from the Phoenicians. Okay, so we have all these languages. Sorry you can't see those super well. So you have Greek, Celt-Iberian in Spain. There's Galatian in Turkey, Gaulish in France, the Pontic in northern Italy, and Noricum, which is in Austria, and Lusitania, which is Portugal. Okay, so I'm kind of winding away from the early introduction, but I want to find some of the main historical common denominators. The tribes, the Celts predominantly just assimilated with the languages and the cultures where they moved to. So if they went into Britain, they started to use a different languages. They maintained certain expressions and terms. And we're going to find that when we talk about the Irish speakers of the 1800s. There's some really neat words and expressions. If I had about 5 hours, we could go through all the cool expressions that we have out there that relate to the Irish. The greatest legacy, as I mentioned, is that they left place names. You go across Europe from Vienna to Brussels to London, all these places come from Celtic names, and many, many other rivers. So you have the town Paris that came from the Celtic tribe, the Paris. The rivers, you have the word Avon. The word Avon from Celtic means river. So you go to Stratford-on-Avon, that's Stratford-on-the-River. The valleys, Glendale, anything with Glen in it. You drive around York County, Lancaster County, Berks County, Cumberland, and you're going to see a lot of place names with Glen in it. That came from Celtic languages. Hill, Penn, the word Penn means a hill. Interestingly, the word caster, like Lancaster, I know it's not Celtic, but all the casters, Doncaster, Lancaster, and so forth, that comes from the Roman word for a fort. Castor was a fort or an encampment. Okay, so the legacy continues into Pennsylvania in the 18th century. But to take a quick look at these, we have the Parisi, Paris, the Belgian Helvetii. When I lived in Europe the first time, I was in my early 20s, and I saw these little circular targas, they call them. They're country identification symbols, like the A was for Austria, and the CH. Everybody would say, what's that CH stand for? The CH stands for Helvetia, for the Confederatio Helveticalis. Treveri, the Trier, and Troyes for Bohemia. They named these places, which are present-day Scotland. They call that Albion, which refers to the word for white. I've mentioned Belgium. Brage is Brittany. Cymru. Cymru is Wales. Well, where do we get the word Wales? Wales came from the Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxons came to the British Isles in the period of 400, 450 to about 600, 700. And they called the people of Wales, who were already there living peacefully, they called them the foreigners. Even though they were ironically, they were the residents. Switzerland, Eire. This word Eire, I would like to mention that to you after I take a sip of vodka. Okay, Eire. Eire is, you've heard Eiringabrá, which means Ireland forever. And the root word of Eire goes back to Indo-European languages. You've heard of the word Arya, Aryan culture. It was not a bad name until 1933 when a guy wrote a book. So the Eire means noble person. The people the Celts considered themselves the noble people. So Eire is where we get that word. Caernarfon is Cornwall. Anyone ever been to Cornwall? Magnificent, isn't it? Okay, just a couple of river names from Irish. We have the Shannon. I'm glad that I know what I'm talking about here because I can't see what's on this slide. I think I know what I'm talking about. Shannon comes from Shannon. Shannon is the Irish, the early Gaelic words for old river. The Thames that runs through London comes from Tamesa, the dark one, Avon, Trent, and so forth. So conclusions about the early Celts. They were originally Indo-European tribes. If your lineage goes back through Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, Swiss, Italian, North Mediterranean, you're probably Indo-European. In all likelihood, I would bet that everyone in this room is at least 50% Indo-European, if not 90%. Okay, so they were Indo-Europeans. They spoke a common language. They had common tools. So archaeologists who dig things up in Hallstatt, which is a beautiful ski town, by the way, in Austria, the area of Hallstatt, they could determine these tools are similar to the ones that we find in France, and the ones we find in Spain, and the ones we find in Ireland. So the tools are important. They used the alphabets of other people. They didn't develop their own alphabet. And the language kind of assimilated with other languages. They left their legacy with place names across Europe. So the modern Celtic languages. This is a picture of a Celtic cross. A Celtic cross, I'm sure many of you know about the Celtic cross, but I'll just review it. In the period of the 5th and 6th century, in what was then Angloland. Angloland was the name of England. It meant it came from the land of the Angles, who were Germans. They came from North Germany, around Denmark and so forth, Jutland, the Jutes, and they were pagans. So most of the early Celts were pagans, and the Angles and the Saxons were pagans. The Church of Rome decided that with Christianity, the Romans had been converted by this time, by the 500s, 600s AD, Common Era. So they felt that in order to convert pagans, they needed to make it acceptable to the pagans. The circle represents the sun god. Now, at the very end of this, I have a picture of myself. That's patronizing, isn't it? I have a picture of myself with a Celtic circle behind me. And they believed in the sun, lining up with the summer solstice and the winter solstice, so with the sun. So the people like Patrick, the priest, there are many Patricks, by the way, and they would take the circle to help embrace the pagans, and then you had the Christian cross with them. All right, so Christianity figures prominently with the Celts in the modern era. I like this slide. This is a great slide. It shows the Celts got sick of the Germanic tribes, the Teutoni, the Germani tribes, and so forth. The Huns were coming across, stealing their land, and they went down into these areas. France, they were settled in here for quite some time, and then the Franks came, the German Franks. Then down in this area, you have the Germanic tribes, the Goths, and the Vandals, you know, those guys that were stealing hubcaps back in the 5th century, the Vandals, and there was the Scotti tribe. The Scotti tribe was Celtic, and the Scotti, there's no coincidence here. The Scotti go up, sorry, I'm really wobbling here. Let me try to go up here. All right, so the Scotti tribe would go up, they came up here into Ireland, present day Ireland, which was called Hibernia. And I'll show the progression of that in a slide or two. Here's a picture of one of the people that was a face painter. They were the Celts. When the Greeks came up around 300 BC, the Greeks encountered, Herodotus, the historian, encountered the people that painted their faces. So the Greeks called them the Prytani, and the Romans borrowed that word. Prytani means face painter. So they called that land Prytanike. Does it sound like something? Prytanike. It sounds like Britain. That's where the word Britain came from. Up until that point, no one knows what it was called. There were some people said it was Amorica, some said it was something else. So you had the Celtic Burians. They were fleeing the Romans, the Germanic tribes. The Celtic Burians and the Scoti went down here and came up to Ireland and Scotland. The Celtic and the Galli were in the west part of present-day France, and they went over into the southwest part of the British Isles. So that's where we got the Welsh origins. Anyone here have some Welsh? Oh, good. Okay, very good. Anyone have Irish? I would think that we have a lot here. We have over 30 million Irish in the United States. Okay, so this is kind of the history. The 5th to the 9th centuries, we have the Scoti tribes that went up through Ireland, present-day Ireland, and up into the northern part. And ironically, they come back to that about 800 years later. And they went over into this area, which is present-day Scotland, where the Picts and the Britons were already there speaking Celtic languages. Interestingly, no one called them Celts. It wasn't until you had 1582, this guy George Buchanan wrote that the Celts were really the Scoti tribe that came up from Hispania. This other fellow, Paul-Yves Chéron, who was a Frenchman, wrote, and I decided to take their works out because they're all in Latin and French and stuff. And he wrote that the Gauls were actually Celtic, who survived as Welsh and Britons. And that's true. That's actually accurate. That was 1703. Edward Lloyd, this fella, is the first person to actually use the word Celt. I read his book. It's crazy. He says these people came from as far as Turkey and even Xinjiang province in China, because they spoke an Indo-European language out there in Xinjiang province, the Uyghurs, and so forth. All right, now they speak a different language now. So the word Celt or Celtic language didn't happen until the 1700s. So we already had Welsh in America by the time he was calling them Celtic languages. So here are the languages. Blue, we have Scottish. The green, Irish, no coincidence. Welsh is red, and then the orange sort of color is Isle of Man, which is right in the middle of the Irish Sea. I had the fortune to go there. Very beautiful. Cornish is the yellow part down here that goes down into Land's End, and then Breton, which is part of France. Now, this is an overwhelming slide. I like this slide. I decided to keep it in because, first of all, you have to have a diagram of languages if you're talking about languages. But this is important for genealogy. You have P Celtic and Q Celtic. Continental European languages are pretty much gone. The language spoken in France is actually a P Celtic. So what does that mean? Linguistically, if anybody wants to stay till about 7 or 8 tonight, I'll be happy to sit and explain the difference between P Celtic and Q Celtic. The P Celtic in Welsh, which was a Celtic language, the word for father was mab, M-A-B, and they shortened it to op. So if you're doing your studies of Welsh background, you're going to have a lot of ops in there. So, for example, forgive me for cutting in front here, I have to see this. So this name, they use a pedigree, the old Celtic. I'm walking away from the screen. The old Celtic naming system used a pedigree system where they used this word op. So Rhys of Rhyfedd of Willem of Philo of David of Hugh of Owen. And then the women used Verk, what they pronounce it Ferk, and they use it with a V-C-H. Ellen, Ferk, Owen, Ferk, David, and so forth. The son or the daughter of, the daughter of, the daughter of. So you have Griffith, Reese, Griffith, William, Hugh, David, Hugh, Owen. Those are all sons of. And then here you see the language. I'm going to get myself tied up in a knot. This is the ancient Irish writing called Ogham. Ogham comes from the Celtic pagan god Ogma, who was the goddess of eloquence. And they wrote these on stones. So they would chip the sides of the stones. If this lectern were a big rock, they would chip the sides, and they would chip it on one side, chip it on another side, and they came up with an alphabet. It's actually an easy alphabet. And this refers to Maki McCoy, the son of the tribe. McCoy was tribe and Maki. So this is where we get the words, we get the letters Mick and Mach come from the ancient Irish for Mach, for son. So coming to America, you thought I'd never get here, did you? Okay. They were seeking the promise mainly to get the hell away from the English. That was the main reason that they wanted to leave. All of these people, Welsh, Scottish, the Irish, wanted to get away from the English. They wanted freedom. They wanted the freedom to practice their religion. So the Welsh come in the 1680s. My family came here in 1699 from Switzerland, bought land from the William Penn and settled in Lancaster County. That's my father's side. My mother's side has a lot of Scotch Irish. Okay, so the Scottish 1700s, they come over there. That's fairly early in the American settlement of the colonies. These are the colonies here. And the Irish come much later because of famine. On North the North, they call it. Okay, my apologies, this is small. But the Welsh came, settled in Pennsylvania and New York. They also settled in Massachusetts. The Scottish settled in Pennsylvania, Virginia, and went down to the Carolinas, mostly North Carolina. The Irish, Pennsylvania, and New York. Why do you think they came to Pennsylvania? It wasn't all because of William Penn. If they were taking a boat, where do you think they would arrive? Philadelphia. And Newcastle, Delaware was a major port. So you had a lot of Irish in northern Delaware. You had a lot of Irish in southeast Pennsylvania, and a lot of Welsh and Scottish and so forth. And they came speaking their languages, depleted their countries of native speakers, and came speaking their languages, and they shared that language with us in Pennsylvania. We have all kinds of expressions that go back to, like, say uncle, comes from Irish. I'll explain that. So most of it was religion. You have the Quakers, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, the Catholics, and they had various reasons. They wanted to get away from Jacobite rebellion, Scottish, and again, there's so much we could talk about with history. Molly Maguire's, the Pittsburgh Renaissance, all those things. But I want to focus on language. Keep focusing on language. So when they came here, they depleted their countries of their languages. I like this slide because it tells where the Irish came from. There are three main dialects of Irish. There's Ulster, there's Connacht, and Munster. So the Irish that I learned, that I have studied, is Connacht. Those three areas are the areas that were most hit with famine. And the Irish people decided, let's get some money. Let's get some money, and we'll send Liam over to America, and then he'll send money back to us, and then we'll keep going over. And 500,000 Irish speakers, Gaelic speakers, left in the mid-1800s. The main potato famine was 1848, but this is on Gaeltacht. Gaeltacht was a region where they still speak Irish. So who were the Scots Irish? The Scots Irish were were actually Scottish. The Scots-Irish were actually Scottish. They came from the lowlands of the southern part of Scotland up near what was Hadrian's Wall. And they were offered land. They were offered land in what were called plantations, such a special word. And they brought their Scots language. Now, the language they spoke was Germanic. It was closer to English than it was to Scottish or Gaelic. I'm going to show you a slide that I have to avoid some confusion. So they were called the Ulster Scots because that part of Northern Ireland was called Ulster. Most of them spoke Scots who came to the United States. Scots was closely associated with Anglo-Saxon, Germanic. So here's a map that shows the Scots-Irish and the paths they took. So they came up here, here's Newcastle. They went up into Newcastle and into Philadelphia, but many of the Scots-Irish, we're talking about people who were originally from Scotland, went over into Northern Ireland and spoke a language that was not Celtic. Many of them. Many of them did speak Irish, many of them did speak Scottish. But they came to America and settled in all sorts of counties around here. Cumberland Valley was one of the main areas in the Harrisburg area. And out into Pittsburgh, we have a lot of influence of Scots-Irish in the Western PA. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the languages, and then we'll wrap it up. So with each language, I'm going to say a couple of significant things about the language, the three main ones. And then at the end of each one, I have some common surnames, family names that come from those languages, and some place names that we have, just like Donegal, near here, Donegal over in Mount Joy. Baltimore, while that's not Pennsylvania, I wanted to focus on Pennsylvania. Baltimore comes from Irish, Bal and Timori, which means the town of the big house. The town of the big house was the Calvert family that brought Catholicism to Maryland. They were instrumental. Okay, so Cymru is a fellow countryman. Cymru is the country. I mentioned Wales. Wales comes from Anglo-Saxon. The Welsh came here with the promise of attractive lands that they could use in Pennsylvania, where they could practice their own politics and they could practice their own religion in Welsh. Everyone read the church, read the Bible in Welsh. And the first thing here, this is an expression, I don't know to whom it's attributed, but many Welsh use this. The first thing a Welshman does in America is build a church. So that the legacy that we have, the place names, many names around Philadelphia. I'm going to get into that in a second. We have the Easterfog festivals. We have two of the largest and longest running festivals, the Welsh festivals in Pennsylvania, actually in the world. And they come from Pittsburgh and Edwardsville, Pennsylvania, up near Scranton. So they wanted to, the Welsh wanted to promote language. I'm going to run through this quickly. I thought you might enjoy some facts. Welsh Ethnic Language Society was founded in Philadelphia. There are 14 colonial generals in the Revolutionary War were Welsh. 18 of 56 signatories of the Declaration of Independence, 11 US presidents, including Thomas Jefferson, and fasten your seatbelts, Barack Obama. Barack Obama has Welsh lineage. The US Census in 2008 had 1.98 million Welsh. Welsh in Pennsylvania, I mentioned the Welsh Tract. William Penn promised land to the Welsh where they could use that land. Penn wanted to call it New Wales. King Charles II did not like the name, and he preferred to call it Penn's Woods, even though apparently William Penn did not like it, did not want to call it Penn's Woods after himself. In the late 1700s, there was a Welsh colony out near Pittsburgh called Cambria, and that's Cambria County right now. I mentioned the Eisteddfod, that means sitting together. Those are music festivals. Welsh Society, Central Pennsylvania, is up in State College. We have some loan words that we get from Welsh. Craig, Dad, flannel, and so forth. When I was in graduate school in Philadelphia, I lived in Westchester and traveled by bus, and the bus driver would always say, next stop, Landfair, next stop, Llewellyn, and Lanner, and all those places. And those are all pronounced, the double L in Welsh is a sound. It's like you're trying to clear your throat in a major way. Clonfair, Clop, Clonard, and Ballackinwood. Anyone from the Philadelphia area? Anyone familiar with the Philadelphia area? Okay, all right. Some heads nodding. So here are some more Welsh place names. Lower Gwynedd, Upper Merion, Malvern. We spoke with our friends in England this morning, and they can see the Malvern Hills, the mountains in Wales from their house. They live southwest of Birmingham. Malvern is around Philadelphia. Bryn Mawr, Philadelphia. And the main line in West Philadelphia got its name because of the Welsh run mills that were all along that area, and the Welsh helped build the railroad. They helped along with Irish help later, but they helped build the railroad, and they referred to that railway as the main line. So all those stops along the way got the name main line from the Welsh. Some Welsh surnames, we have Collins, Davies. Jones is the #1 name that comes from Welsh. Lewis, Moore, Owen, and they all have different meanings. Enthusiasm, noble. My apologies, trying to read from the side. Scottish Gaelic, so the tribe from Iberia. You have the Dalriata, which was that kingdom of the north. Scots that went up into Scotland. So the Irish Greek speakers were actually the original foundation of Scottish language. Scottish language is fairly young. It goes back to the 1300s. By way to avoid confusion, I had a student who wrote a paper about the Scottish language, and he confused them with all of these. There's Airsa, the Airsa language. There's Scottish English, where they speak English with a trill, and they use certain words like the wee laddies and the bonny lassies and so forth. But there's Scots language, and that's this in the yellow. Scots language is actually a Germanic language. I mentioned that. Scots. And then there's Norn. Norn is up in the Orkney Islands and Shetland Islands, and that language came from, anyone want to guess? Norway. The Vikings came from the Vikings. The Vikings were all over Ireland. And then there's Scottish Gaelic, and that's the main Celtic language in Scotland. Scottish loanwords that we have. Clan. Clan is a family with their children. Craig, which is the same as Welsh. Plaid, slogan, battle cry. Trousers comes from Scottish. There are many other. This is just a sampling. Anybody here from Western PA? Have you ever heard the word yins? Yes. Okay. So the Scots and the Scots-Irish, who settled a lot in the western part of the state, they would say you ones, and it became Ewans, and it became yins. And that's a very popular, like yins see the Stillers game. That's a popular expression in Western PA. Scottish place names. A lot of those come from names of people. Many come from names of people. McLaren and Mercer, Campbelltown. So Scottish surnames. Many of them are toponymics. Toponymics are place names like the hill or the river, so forth, like burn. Burns, O'Byrne, O'Brien, O'Brien comes from by the street. Okay, last language I'm going to do is Irish. The influence that we have from Irish, 30 million people in the U.S. that claim their heritage. That's 2021 figures. Some of the expressions, crony, meaning the favorite ones, slugger, slugger, word, the polish, cop. This is the word. Everyone thinks that a policeman is called a cop because they had copper badges. There's not a lot of evidence that police wore copper badges. They more likely had brass or they had nickel plated or something. But the word cop in Irish means chief protector, somebody who seizes people who are doing bad things, and so they call him cop. It was never meant with any disrespect. Sucker comes from sucker, which means somebody who's fresh. Oh, here comes a sucker, somebody that we can play tricks on. The Irish loan words that we have, these all came with the Irish. Bob, Colleen, the name Colleen means a woman, a young woman. A brogue, if you speak with a brogue, that means that you speak fancy, because there's the Irish Celtic shoe, a leather shoe, almost like wingtips on gentlemen's dress shoes, where they have all the little dots and the little swirls and so forth. That's called a brogue in Irish. So if somebody spoke with a brogue, they spoke with a fancy accent. If you speak broad, broad means you speak with a thick accent that relates to a specific region. They speak with a brogue from Connemara. And so that's what that relates to. Smithereen. Smithereen means a very tiny bit. A slob. Actually, this is an Old Norse word from the Vikings, but the word slob means mud. And last but not least with this is wishkiwacha. Wishkiwacha is the water of life. This is where we got the word whiskey from Irish. Place names: Tyrone, Armagh, Drumore, Avoca, the Keys Rocks. Donegal means port of the foreigners. Dunnagal. Ardmore, great height. Duncan, if you've ever driven up along the west side on Route 15, west side of Susquehanna, north of Harrisburg, Duncan, Conlon's Fort, Deary, and Tyrone is Owen's territory. So these are all place names. Now, just as a historical interest, I'm almost at the end. Out of historical interest, the Civil War, the Irish played a significant role in the Civil War. And I wouldn't do this if it weren't for the Irish language having some connection. There were actually, at Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, there was actually the 116th from Philadelphia that were all Irish, and there were from Tennessee, I think it was the 10th Infantry. They were all speaking Irish, and they could hear each other speaking Irish. And so I have a couple slides just to show you, these are the flags that were used in the Civil War with Irish writing on it. Over here, this Confederate flag, Gary Gilbert, Ireland forever, and they have the expression father, Father. And that was the English writing for that. And then this grouping over here, we never retreated from the clash of swords. That was on the Union side. That was the flag of the first New York. There were people who wrote diaries who were in the Civil War who talked about those damn green flags because they were Irish or they weren't Irish, but they knew how tough the Irish were. They were fighters, they would stick to it. And so the Union fought against the Confederacy at places like Gettysburg, where kin was fighting kin. why did the Confederates, why did many of the Irish go to the South? Because they viewed the Union more like the King of England. And the King of England was oppressive. And they felt that the Irish were fighting for their freedom. So that's what I would talk about. Clear the way. This is how to take its charge. Okay. Irish common surnames. I'm in home stretch here. Murphy, O'Byrne. They all have some significance to some other high king. Owen the king, they take it from another name. Welshman or foreigner, Walsh, your last name is Walsh. All of these Irish surnames were brought to Pennsylvania. Here are some expressions. And then I think this is my next to last slide. Say uncle comes from Anatole. The Irish came to New York and Philadelphia. Those were the two main ports of entry. So they stayed where they could get a job. So they spread the language among others, and it became part of the American English vernacular. So say uncle will say uncle, have mercy. Duke it out. Turgan. Turgan is an Irish word which means to hammer or pound or thump. Big shot comes from show. Show means the big jewel or the big chief. He's the big shot. That came from Irish, big shot. Buckaroo, buckaroo. Rough wild road. Play chicken. Chakahan. Chakahan. Chakahan is somebody who flees or runs. So he's a chicken. That we would take the Irish words and make them sound more like English. That's where we have some language influence from Irish. Holy cow comes from holy cock. Cock meaning sorrow, grief. My favorite is holy mackerel. I'm not a sayer of holy mackerel, but holy McCree. McCree means the son of royalty. And people would hear holy McCree, and when an Irishman would speak it, and then they would mimic it. And the word slán lot means stay healthy. Slán. When you hear slán, you can almost hear so long. Slán. Okay, conclusions. Place names, Welsh, Scottish, Irish. We have hundreds and hundreds of them in Pennsylvania. Duncannon, Montfair, Donegal. Place names that come from individuals, McGill Heights, McAllister's Crossroads, and so forth, and expressions like yins, whiskey, galore. Galore, I didn't mention that on the one slide. It means galore, which means plenty of lore. The word we have in English. So my Celtic roots, this is a Celtic circle in the back, probably about 3,000 years old. Celtic circle that was used to line up with the sun. And this was about 10 o'clock at night because I was there almost for the summer solstice, but it was cloudy. And the sun would come up, would go down over there on the west. That was the west. Come up and line up with key stones. My particular lineage, I have Campbell and I have Stewart, ironically, because they were fighters. They were fighting clans. Stewart and Campbell came from my father's side, my mother's side. McCullough, and I have Irish. So they were Scots-Irish, mainly. And I have Irish and Brown, my great-great-grandfather on my mother's side. Okay, thank you. It is Gormahagat in Irish. Jonathan Thor is Welsh. Gormai is Manx. Tapabli is Scottish. Gormasi is Cornish. And Trugare is Greek. Thank you. Questions?
Can they ask any questions? Yes.
Yes. I don't know. I know I've run a fair amount of time.
Well, I was wondering if you've ever been down to the bottom, I guess, of Scotland, which is the one that looks like a shoe. Like this one looks like a shoe.
Yes.
And when you go that yourself in an area with, I went over there and I went down to Stark. I don't know if you've ever heard.
I have.
Okay. But, you know, you have pictures of the fellow who's a Pennsylvanian, who was standing there with his piece of fighting stick, and you can have your picture taken with him. But if you go the whole way down to that shoe that sort of looks like it's about that long and has a foot on the end of it, and you go over the bridge, because you go from one side to the other, you have a bridge that crosses the creek, and then you get to these areas, these small areas, and I went to Straka, which was an area that had, at the bottom of the shoe, you have a wall with stuff on it, and all kinds of interesting details that look like they go back hundreds and hundreds of years. They're down at the bottom of the shoe. So, you know, you're coming down like this, and then you go over here and you cross the bridge, and you're on the other side, and then you get to Straka, which has an English person that we know. I mean, my daughter was over there for 2 months or 4 months and took a class over there. But I went over to visit her, and then we crossed the bridge, and they have fantastic old churches over there. The one that I saw in Straka was a very old church.
It's very, very interesting.
And it's fascinating.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I've been to southern Scotland, but I don't think I've been to Shoe. No, I would remember that. Did anyone, was there anything in this presentation that anyone could connect to with your family or with expressions that you use? There are many, many expressions that we have in Irish, like the surname, the last name of Houlihan. Houlihan is where we got the word hooligan, because the family were such hellraisers. There are so many things. Was there anything that anyone was able to maybe do an aha moment, like, oh, my grandmother or great grandmother? Well, we didn't have a lot of hands go up when I asked if they were Irish and Scottish. Welsh. Is there anything with Welsh? No. Okay. Yes.
I got cursed one time. My maiden name was Elliot. It was 2 L's, 2 T's. And one of the ladies on the ship, she mentioned the fact that the more letters you had, double letters, the more down you were. And she said over on the border that this England and Wales, I guess it was, that the Elliot, 2 L's, 2 T's were horse thieves.
I haven't heard that. I mean, it'd be interesting. So I'm sure you, yes.
Just one quick thing, I was glad that you were specific about Scots, Irish.
Yes.
I inadvertently offended a woman who was from Scotland by saying, well, we have a lot of Scotch Irish. And she was terribly.
My first time to Scotland, full disclosure, my first time to Scotland, I went to the airport in Aberdeen, up in the north. I used to work with naval intelligence then. And I went in there and I wanted to exchange English pounds for Scottish pounds. And I said, could I get some British pounds? And they said, oh, bloody hell, we are British. Yeah, my wife and I have traveled there. She has read all of the Diana Gavin books on Outlander, and whenever she comes across a Scottish word, I always have fun trying to figure it out. I can't get them all. Scottish is a very, it's an unusual and challenging language. So, yes.
My question was on discerning voice. Would you say that's Welsh or Irish?
Voice?
Voice.
I would say it's Irish. town is also Scots Irish. And some of the, like the name Price, actually in Welsh comes from Greece. Greece. And when you say up Greece, you say up Greece. So Greece actually becomes Price. So there are some names like that that can, over time, over hundreds and hundreds of years, could have morphed into voice. It's all very interesting to me. Thank you for your patience. I'm sorry. I'll be happy to, yes.
Yeah, we have time for a few more questions, I think. There's a couple online.
Okay.
One of them asks if they said her grandmother always told them to put on a Josie when going outside. She's wondering if you knew Josie was
A Josie?
Yeah.
Anyone have an idea what that is?
It's a sweater, I guess.
No, I haven't heard that one.
The other question was to tell us about red hair.
Everybody
wants to know about red hair.
There is a secondary gene that is associated with the R1b haplogroup, and that this is the R1b haplogroup is all from the Y chromosome. The Y comes from the paternal side, and the X chromosome comes from the maternal side. The Y is much more prolific. I knew I should have done a little bit more on this red hair. Once I opened that Pandora's box, but geneticists have looked at this R1b haplogroup, and they've seen the heat map of where most of them wound up, and they wound up in the British Isles, largely in the extremities of the British Isles. And that subgene is called M1CU or something. It's just numbers. I do have an interesting feature with red hair, linguistically, that goes out into China. I mentioned Xinjiang, the Xinjiang province of Western China. It's about 2,000 years ago, there was a discovery, an archaeological discovery of Buddhists, and there were paintings on the caves out in the Tara Makla Desert, and there were paintings on the caves of red-haired people, and they found mummies, and they all had red hair. Now, that's nice from an archaeological standpoint, but if you look at the language they spoke, which was written in papyrus in the 5th and 6th century, which was preserved in walled and casements, linguists have been able to associate that language way out in China with Old Irish. With Old Irish. Many words in Old Irish are identical to this language called Tocharian. Tocharian is the language. So some people don't buy it, but it's an interesting feature. But yes, there are many people who have that genetic sequence that gives you a predisposition to maybe 70%, 30% have red hair. You go to Ireland, though, there are a lot of people with dark hair. Not everybody has red hair. Is there any other online question?
No, I think that's it for online.
Thank you. I'm sorry if I've
How well did they get along with the Germans in central Pennsylvania?
That's an interesting question. Linguistically, the Germans, a lot of them came here for religious reasons, as did the Scots Irish, Scottish, and the Welsh came for religious reasons. And so they pretty much respected each other. I'm not an authority on how well the Germans and the Scots Irish got along. Anyone else have an insight on that? Yeah, what I have read is that the Germanic speaking in the 1700s, we had more German speakers come as immigrants than any other language being spoken. German was never considered to be the language of the United States of America. A lot of people, that's kind of a myth. they did consider speaking German during the Revolutionary War to confound the English, kind of like code talkers with NAPO. They would speak in a different language. But yeah, I think most people, most people were farm. The Germans were farm people, as were the Scots-Irish. You had industrialists like Carnegie, who was Scottish, out in Pittsburgh. But most of them pretty much kept to themselves. Thank you. Jimmy. Thank you much. Is that it? Meeting is adjourned. Thank you. So I can play some music. While I'm here.